Good afternoon. My name is Philip Munoz. I direct the Tocqueville Program for Inquiry into Religion and Public Life, and I also direct our Constitutional Studies minor, and both programs are serving as the hosts of today's event. Our Constitutional Studies minor started a few years ago, and if there might be any undergraduates interested in learning about it, I invite you to come talk to me after our event. The idea for today's event was actually student-driven. The Tocqueville program has 10 undergraduate Tocqueville fellows, and we got together last month. And our fellows meet with our distinguished visitors. When we bring people to campus, when we brought Ross Douthat, the New York Times columnist, last month, they had a meal with Mr. Douthat. In a few weeks, we're going to bring Justice Alito to campus, and our fellows will meet with Justice Alito. The other thing they do, besides helping us welcome our friends to campus, is they come up with their own events, and this is one of our fellows' events. So I know a number of our fellows are here, so thank you for all your work and your very good idea. Yeah. I'd be delighted to talk with the undergraduates about the fellowship opportunity as well. A few people I'd like to thank before I introduce. Becca Self will introduce our speakers. First, the whole dining hall staff and their director, Chris Abayasinya. Thank you very much for all your work. The food was beautiful, and so please join me in thanking them. When we're done, if you wouldn't mind bringing your trays, if you brought trays from downstairs over to the corner, anything we can do to help the dining hall staff would be very much appreciated. I also want to thank and recognize and praise my assistant, Jennifer Smith. Usually Jen runs at this point. As anyone who has run anything knows, I don't really do any of the work for these. She does all the work. So thank you very much, Jen, for everything you're doing. As I mentioned, our real vocation at our programs is our undergraduates and our undergraduate fellows. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Becca Self. Becca is a senior political science major, lives off campus now, and she will introduce our speakers.
Hi everyone, thank you. I am, for the record, not the Tocqueville Fellow who originally came up with the idea for this wonderful event. Seamus is off in Chicago being a superstar running the marathon this weekend, so I'm introducing our speakers on his behalf. Professor Michael Desch is joining us today even though he's officially on leave from the University of Notre Dame, and we're very grateful. He is, of course, a top-notch scholar, an expert in international affairs and foreign policy, the author of several books, dozens of articles, many of them on the topic of the Middle East. Professor Desch has experience in administration as well. Besides being the chair of the Political Science Department at Notre Dame and co-director of the International Security Program, he's worked as the founding director at the Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M. He's worked on the staff of a U.S. Senator, in the State Department, and in the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Congressional Research Service. My own experience is that Professor Desch is a wonderful teacher. He's going to be doing the first segment of our presentation today, teaching us the background of this agreement, and we're very blessed to have him here with us. So please join me in welcoming Professor Desch. Rear Admiral Philip Durr began his long and fruitful professional life with the Naval ROTC program here at the University of Notre Dame 50 years ago, as the thing on his...
54 years.
54 years ago. That deserves a round of applause. While earning master's degrees in government and public administration and a PhD in political economy and government from Harvard, he served in the West Pacific, the North Atlantic, and the Mediterranean. Even before all these international experiences, Rear Admiral Durr spent 17 years abroad as his father was a diplomat. Later he served as the Director of Military Planning for the Middle East region, during the first Reagan administration and commanded a fleet in the Mediterranean. Since then, Rear Admiral Durr has worked as a Vice President of Tenneco Incorporated, as President of Ship Systems for Northrop Grumman, a global security company, and as a visiting professor of the University of Southern Mississippi, where he shared his experiences and expertise with many people. For his service, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, the Defense Distinguished Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, and the list goes on. We're very honored and excited to have Rear Admiral Durr and Professor Desch with us today. Please give me another.
Thanks very much, Becca, for that kind introduction. Philip, I had to confess to a little bit of hesitancy when I got your kind invitation to speak in this series. Professors for lunch. That didn't strike me as very appetizing. Most of the professors I know are pretty gristly. So anyhow, this thing's been going on for 3 years or so. But when I got the invitation, I got downright nervous because I'm USDA prime, and professors for lunch. But when I heard that there was going to be an Admiral on the menu as well too, then I got less worried. I'm just hoping, Admiral, you're not too salty. I mean, what could I say? I'm on leave. I had to come up with something. So I've got 3 tasks. First of all, I'm going to lay out very quickly for you the situation before the deal that the Obama administration negotiated with the Iranians. Secondly, I want to outline very quickly exactly what the deal does, just so you have an idea of what it's supposed to do. And then finally, I'm going to take my analytical hat off and I'm going to get polemical on you. And I'm going to give you my take on the good deal, raw deal debate. Now, this is a very polemical issue, or it's an issue that lends itself to strong feelings. Probably the most strident, but certainly not the only, example of heated rhetoric to come out of the political process about this was former Arkansas governor and current Fox News commentator and current Republican aspirant for the presidential nomination, Mike Huckabee, dismissed the deal on the grounds that it would take the Israelis and march them to the door of the oven. And in fact, you may recall when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke at the United Nations 2 years ago, he had a great graphic to sort of convey the sense of danger that he thought that the Iranian nuclear program posed to the state of Israel. So you had this sort of Wile E. Coyote, time bomb with the fuse burning away. So I want to step back and just give you a little bit of the facts that Admiral Durr and I will then argue about in terms of our interpretation of them. And first, I want to talk about the military balance between the various sides before the deal. Okay, I'm sort of a big believer in net assessment. I want to know in any given potential military confrontation what's the capability of the various sides. And the first element of the net assessment I want to look at is the nuclear balance. And the nuclear balance today basically is overwhelmingly in favor of the good guys. And by the good guys, I mean the United States and Israel. Iran does not have a nuclear weapon at this point. More importantly than just having a nuclear weapon, I mean, North Korea's got 6 of these things. Whether they could actually deliver them anywhere and whether they'd actually work is another matter. But beyond having a nuclear warhead, you have to have the capability of delivering it somewhere so you can explode it on a potential adversary. And again, if you look at the balance in nuclear delivery systems, and there are basically 3 ways you can reliably deliver a nuclear weapon. You can always put a nuclear weapon in the hold of a ship or put it on the back of a flatbed trailer or something like that, but that's not a very reliable way of delivering a nuclear weapon. We talk in the Cold War jargon about a strategic triad. And a strategic triad for the United States, for the former Soviet Union and most other countries involves land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, sea-based submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and aircraft. And again, if you do the net assessment on this, the good guys have an overwhelming advantage. Iran has a theoretical capability of delivering nuclear weapons based on medium-range ballistic missiles that they have and that are currently configured for conventional warhead delivery. But that's one leg of a 3-legged stool. Finally, I want to give you a sense of what the authoritative arm of the U.S. intelligence community had concluded. Whoops, what did I do here? That got help. I think the Iranians hacked into this. I told them, wait till Admiral gets up. I'm going to be, you're not going to want to hack my talk. Now, this is too small for you to actually read from out there, but I'll read it to you myself. This is from the National Intelligence Estimate of 2007, which is the definitive statement from the U.S. intelligence community on the issue of the Iranian nuclear program. And in its summary judgment, they judged with high confidence in the fall of 2003 that Tehran had halted its nuclear weapons program. And they judged with high confidence that that halt had remained in place during the period since 2003. Now, they were pretty sure that the Iranians had not restarted that nuclear program. The big area of debate within the intelligence community was the intentions going forward of the Iranian regime. Were they going to try to develop a capability that would walk right up into the edge of having the ability to weaponize their civilian nuclear program, or were they going to do something else? And that's it seems to me, the legitimate debate that one could have since 2007. They also judged with high confidence that the halt in 2003 in the Iranian nuclear program was primarily in response to increasing international scrutiny and pressure resulting from exposure of Iran's previously undeclared nuclear work. So this is very important. The attention on Iran in 2003 played a key role in getting them to stop overwork on their nuclear program. Okay, a much less intrusive regime, I should point out, than what we have today. Okay, so that's the situation up until, basically October 9th, 2015. So let's talk a little bit about what the deal actually does. And here, I'm going to give you some elementary physics, because I don't go any further than elementary physics We'll give you the graduate course on that. But basically, what you got to keep in mind is there are two ways to develop a nuclear bomb. You can do it through the uranium track, or you can do it through the plutonium track. And the agreement deals with both of these tracks. Okay. Second thing, so you have sort of the geography in mind. I have a small map of the major Iranian nuclear facilities. I'm going to be talking about some of them by name. So let's go first. Most attention focuses on the uranium route to developing a nuclear weapon. And then most of the discussion of the Iranian agreement has focused on the uranium elements of it. Now, there are two major facilities that are associated with uranium production and enrichment in Iran that you need to keep in mind. One is a complex near the holy city of Qom called Fordo. And Fordo is a underground facility associated with the Iranian military that's deeply hardened, and its purpose was to produce enriched uranium, primarily through the use of centrifuges to take it up to an enrichment level that would make it useful as fissile material. Just a quick pop quiz here. What's the level of uranium enrichment that you need to have fissile or explodable uranium? Anybody know off the top of their head? Please.
About
90%. So keep that in mind. The second facility in the uranium stream is an above-ground commercial uranium enrichment facility at a place called Natanz, which is right here. Fordo, as I said, is close to the holy city of Qom. Now, what the agreement does is that it forces the Iranians to repurpose Fordo as a research center. So it'll have no capacity for enrichment. Now, this is important because Fordo is a facility that's hardened and deep underground. And the conventional view is that if you want to take it out using military force, the only military that has the weaponry and the capability of doing that is the United States. The Israelis do not yet have that capacity. So getting this thing offline is a big deal. Now, Natanz is different. It's a commercial facility, and it will continue to do reprocessing. So, as some of the Republican aspirants have pointed out in various comments on this, the centrifuges will still spin at Natanz. But under this agreement, the number of centrifuges that will be enriching uranium will go from almost 20,000 to 5,000. And secondly, they'll be limited to a maximum enrichment level of about 3.7%, not 90%. Now, the big part of this deal has to do with the pretty significant stockpile of low enriched uranium, LEU, that the Iranians have. And it's not enriched anywhere near 90%. It's about close to 20%. But there's a significant amount of it, and it's important because if they did decide to try to enrich up to 90%, they would start with the 20% enriched stockpile that they have. 98% of this is going to go away. It's going to be moved out of Iran. So that's a pretty big deal. Okay, so that's what the deal does for the uranium route. Now, there's been much less public on the plutonium route to an uranium bomb, which is a little bit strange, because actually I think most of the cognoscenti in the nuclear world would say the bigger danger of weaponization of a nuclear program is on the plutonium stream, not so much on the uranium stream. And here, there are a couple of facilities that are important. Iran has a research reactor at a place called Iraq, not Iraq, that is a heavy water reactor which produces, as a byproduct of its operations, highly enriched plutonium. And it can produce it very quickly and in a way that's very efficient. And so shutting down, or actually again repurposing Iraq so it doesn't produce highly enriched plutonium is a big deal. Because this, if you really wanted to, if you were, one of the Ayatollahs, and you really wanted to sprint to a bomb, the most efficient way to do it would be via plutonium than via uranium. Okay, so that's the objective, non-polemical part of the talk. So now let me get polemical. What does the deal buy for the international community? And more importantly, what does it buy for the United States? Well, first of all, it opens the door to a much more intrusive inspections regime in Iran than we've had up till this point. And this is really important because a lot of the criticism of the deal was that there were some elements, particularly associated with the sub-agreements the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna agreed to with the Iranians, that don't seem so great. But under this agreement, we're going to have a much clearer window into the world of Iran, and that's a good thing. So much so that a former deputy director of the National Reconnaissance Office, that's the part of the U.S. intelligence community that handles satellites and overhead surveillance, characterized this part of the agreement as an intelligence bonanza. I mean, he was just, literally frothing at the mouth. He thought this was such a great deal. Secondly, the deal increases the breakout time if the Iranians were to wake up one morning and say, we want to go at this point. If they decided that today, which we don't think they have, they could probably develop a nuclear explosive device in 1 to 2 months. The agreement gives us a year, and a year is a pretty significant improvement. Thirdly, the agreement is slated to last between 15 and 25 years. There's a different timeline on various parts of it. But 15 to 25 years is a big deal. Why is it a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because it's a breathing space, but it's also a big deal because a lot of things can happen inside Iran in that period of time. Think about the changes that have happened in the People's Republic of China over the past 40 years. Just dramatic changes, so in a relatively short period of time. Same thing could happen to in Iran. Now, the agreement does not preclude the reimposition of sanctions if the Iranians cheat. Okay, and in fact, many people have said that the Obama administration made a mistake in promising to reduce sanctions as quickly as the agreement does. But what they forget is that unilateral sanctions by the United States aren't really going to do very much in terms of the Iranian economy. The key thing is a multilateral sanctions regime that includes Europe and many of the other advanced industrial economies. And for better or for worse, the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese have decided that they're going to give the Iranians a shot. And so given that, we really had no option for unilaterally imposing sanctions. But we can do it down the road if we can build allied support for doing so. Now, let's talk a little bit about the military option. And the two elements of the military option are what the United States could do and what the State of Israel could do. And I'm just going to talk very generally about that. This is a good news, bad news story. The good news is there's nothing in the agreement that prevents the United States from unilaterally deciding the Iranians are running towards breakout and we're going to use military force to try to stop them from doing it. The bad news, and this is true with the agreement or without, is there's also a consensus that airstrikes by themselves would only be a temporary stopgap if the Iranians do decide to pursue breakout. The only way you could reliably prevent the Iranians forever and ever from pursuing a weaponized nuclear program is to have American boots on the ground. And of course, we have some recent experience with American boots on the ground in two countries, co-located pretty close to Iran, and you can imagine why that particular military option isn't so attractive. So for me, given all of this, I think the deal the Obama administration cut is, as Winston Churchill said of democracy, it's the worst form of government except for all the other options. That's how I feel about this agreement. And in fact, I put my good name where my mouth is, and I was part of a group of about 50 civilian academic national security experts who placed an ad in the New York Times about 3 weeks ago, basically making a shorter version of this argument. So that's my story. We'll see if I stick to it under the withering naval gunfire from Admiral Desch. He's going to be like Paul Harvey, and he's going to give you the rest of the story. Leave my briefcase on the bus here.
Well, first of all, let me tell you how honored I am to be on a panel to discuss this important subject. Some of you may have noticed that I've already jousted with Professor Desch over his advocacy for a U.S. strategy of restraint in the pages of Notre Dame magazine. So this exchange is following a course that we've already charted, to use a naval term. First of all, thank Professor Munoz for inviting me, and I very much appreciate that generous introduction from Becca Self. Before I get started on my view of the Iranian nuclear deal, let me just, without trying to engage in a polemic, correct some factual information, at least as I see it. Iranian mid-range ballistic missiles exist in great numbers. They threaten, given their range, the State of Israel. And while one could argue that they don't have a nuclear weapon today, they have chemical weapons that they've not disclosed, and they could also put together a fairly dirty weapon using just unrefined uranium. And when that spreads around in a place like Haifa, as we saw during the Iraq War, when they fired chemical weapons into Israel, it can result in fairly significant casualties. And it is not by happenstance that Ordo is co-located with a site most holy to Shia Islam, so that anyone who attacked that site would probably visit significant damage on a site which is as holy to the Shia as Jerusalem is to Christians, Jews, and Sunni Muslims. As to time and change in Iran, to think that in 25 years we'll see a significant change in Iran, let me remind this audience that Khomeini came to power in 1977, about 38 years ago, virulently anti-American, anti-Israeli, long before there were any nuclear weapons research that were problematic, and long before any UN sanctions were in place. They don't need UN sanctions, and they don't need a nuclear weapons ban to keep it from being anti-American and virulently anti-American. I would only, before I begin what I think is the core of my pitch, I would say this to you. Listen to what the Iranian state news channel said about this agreement just before it was signed. Quote, "The fact is that Obama needs this deal much more than we do. Iran can give him that. And only Iran can give him that. They have retreated on several issues and compromised on their own red lines," speaking of the US. Whether or not this perception is fair, it is a perception nonetheless, and perceptions drive behavior. The Iran nuclear deal, its formal name is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And I would point out to you that the opposition and the criticism of this deal that I will make is not centered so much on the details, which Michael showed you, as much as on the nature of what's called a siloed agreement. This agreement was negotiated disassociating it from any other aspect of the US-Iran relationship, or the European-Iran relationship for that matter, but not the Chinese and Russian relationship with Iran, which has always been very supportive and indeed helpful to their nuclear program. But we're more concerned about the conduct and the stated policies of the Iranian government. But there are several problems with the details of the agreement that Professor Desch did not miss. One of it is called the possible military dimension, or PMD, of Iran's past nuclear work. In the absence of full knowledge of past nuclear weapons research and related activities, can we design, have we designed, an effective verification system for the future? Do we know that, notwithstanding the publicity on these sites, do we know that we've really found all the secret sites in Iran? Do we know whether or not there aren't any more laboratories? Is there anything in the conduct of the Iranian government over the last 30 years that would lead you to conclude that they probably have divulged everything they've done in the nuclear area? The roadmap, as it's called, towards resolving the PMD issue leads to secretive exchanges between IAEA technical expert meetings and the IAEA access to documents and, quote, certain sites, as agreed to by the Iranians. In short, the deal includes separate confidential agreements with the US not in possession of details. But defenders of the agreement assert that full and honest disclosure of past weaponization activities was, quote, never in the cards, to quote John Kerry. Who says? Who says? That's an assertion, not a fact. Secondly, the IAEA access to the sensitive sites on a timeline is a problem. We fought hard for no-notice surprise inspections. We didn't get it. We yielded on the point. And now we get a 24-hour rule. So if you declare you want to visit a site to the Iranian government, they have to first agree to let you visit the site. And secondly, you have to give them 24 hours. And that raises an interesting question. Why 24 hours? 24 hours let you cover up a lot of things, but why even have a time exclusion on an inspection, unless you're trying to hide something perhaps? The restrictions on conventional arms transfers and ballistic missile activities. The agreement, on a side note, provides that for 5 years, the world can't sell conventional weapons to Iran, and for 8 years, they're denied any ballistic missile technology. Well, the Russians have just delivered the most sophisticated air defense system they have to the Iranians, or agreed to deliver it, the S-300. And I would only point out to you that Russia and China, respectively, have provided an enormous amount of cruise missile technology to the Iranians over the last 15 to 20 years. And Russia and China are party to this deal. And they fought hard never to exclude Iran from the technologies that the agreement does. And we had to fight, almost take it to the mat to get 5 and 8. The other reason that we're given that this deal is a good thing because we can snap back the sanctions if we detect a violation on the Iranian side. That, ladies and gentlemen, is nonsense. First of all, there has to be complete agreement within the IAEA that there's been a violation. And take a look at the composition of the IAEA if you want to see a very significant mix of both countries friendly to us and those that are not so friendly to us. But they have to have agreement within the IAEA. It then has to go to the Security Council for discussion and deliberation. How much time is that going to take? That's not a snapback. That could be months and years trying to get the sanctions put back in place if we detect an Iranian violation, if we, the US, believe we've detected a violation. The second point I'd make is, can we trust a regime active in destabilizing the Middle East, intervening directly in the internal affairs of Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Gaza, and Iraq, to honor an agreement with those who oppose their intervention? How will the $100 billion that's released immediately to the Iranians be spent? How much of it will go to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that trains and supports Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen? How do we control the flow of funds to that organization, which is very prominent on the world terrorist stage? Defenders point out that critics of the nuclear deal are correct, that nothing in the it's called the Joint Comprehensive, help me here, Michael, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Defenders point out that critics of the nuclear deal are correct, that nothing in the JCPOA prevents Iran from continuing to destabilize the region. By the same token, they say, nothing prevents the US and allies from countering that behavior. But what about a policy of restraint, defended so eloquently by my colleague in print? How's that working for you in Syria today, with the Russians attacking the factions in Syria that we've been supporting, and the president's red lines that never existed? Thirdly, why do we acclaim this administration's critique of what President Obama calls the rut of history, the term he used in defending his agreement? What do we make of the death of 242 Marines in Beirut as a result of an Iranian design and Iranian weapons? What do we make of the provision of advanced Iranian improvised explosive devices shipped to Iraq, which maimed or mutilated thousands of our troops? How did we exchange pleasantries and jokes with an Iranian team when we concluded this agreement while 4 Americans were still imprisoned in Iran? Escaping the rut of history expresses a deep scorn for the past, a zeal for newness and rupture, an arrogance about old struggles and old accomplishments. But it begs the argument that in some cases a continuity in policy may be worth considering. Witness the durability of the Korean alliance, the prosperity of the Korean economy, and the democracy that is so vibrant in South Korea today. None of it would be possible but for the continuing alliance with the United States. Obama believes that we owe Iran for overthrowing Mossadegh, an Iranian dictator in 1953, and there's no argument that the CIA engineered that revolution. But one has to ask, if Mossadegh was a precursor to what's happened in Iran since Khomeini, I'm not sure we weren't well advised, and we don't have to apologize for it. Now, what to make of the past agreement statements of Iranian leaders which have been issued since the agreement was signed? We're the great Satan, and we persist. Iranians' worldview, or Weltanschauung, is fiery theological anti-Americanism, which celebrates cruelty on a bestial scale, virulent sexism, religious discrimination, and homophobia. How's that for a deal with a great party? We are told that our engagement with Iran encourages moderates. And Obama likes to think when he speaks of Iran that he speaks of its people. But in practice, he extended his hand to the regime that oppresses people. Obama exhorts the people of Iran to speak up for the future they seek. What happened the last time that they tried to speak in 2009, when hundreds were killed and thousands imprisoned for resisting the regime? Fifthly, how can we guard against circumventions from North Korea? North Korea's got nuclear weapons. North Korea tried to export nuclear weaponization to Syria. And the Israelis took it out, not us. We just tried to discourage them from taking it out. They took it out. They transfer missiles all over the world. They have nuclear weapons technology, and they have plutonium and enriched uranium. What's to keep that from finding its way to Iran where it can be weaponized? Where is it in the agreement that they can't do that? And yet, the declaration of the administration is that this is the best deal we can get. The most definitive path by which Iran will not get a nuclear weapon because, quote, every pathway to nuclear weapons development is cut off. No. The accord provides at least a respite of 15 years against a sudden breakout. And there is no evidence that Iran has made a strategic decision to turn away from the path that it refuses to acknowledge. If the deal does not prevent Iranian nuclear weapons in perpetuity from acquiring nuclear weapons, then it does not solve the problem that it was designed to solve. The alternatives, we're told, there is no better deal. Are we sure? Are we sure? How do we know there isn't a better deal? We have enormous numbers of financial strictures that we could have put in place to turn the heat up on Iran, which we forewent in lieu of negotiations with our 5 European partners, the Soviet Union and Russia. I'm given the whole speak. Russia and China. The problem with finding a violation after the sanctions are lifted is you can imagine that hundreds, if not thousands, of European businesses and investors, including some American ones over time, will find their way to Iran to profit from a market that's been closed effectively for 15 years. How easy is it going to be to mount reprisals or take military action in a country that is now populated with Western investors and Western businesses? That's a pipe dream. Nobody will tolerate the thought of an attack on Iran if it entails damage to Western interests. Certainly, if we uncover violations, as I mentioned before, we have to hope that the Russians and the Chinese will agree. Because even though there's a veto-proof peace, the IAEA in itself has to confirm that there's been a violation. And all the others have to agree. Because otherwise, if you don't, I mean, a veto is one thing, but if you can't get 3 of the 5 or 3 of the 5 plus 1 to agree, you haven't got an agreement. In short, the JCPOA, as it's affectionately known, strengthens a contemptible regime and in effect rewards them for their record as the leading state sponsor of terror. Obama's declaration that war is the only alternative is palpable nonsense. Let me just give you one example. In any event, the one thing we can be sure of is that the second most important antagonist to an Iranian nuclear program will not stand idle if it independently gauges that a breakout is imminent. Pull on that string a little further and ask yourself whether providing Israel with the best penetrating bomb technology we had 10 years ago might have deterred Iran from pursuing the weaponization of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you both. We have time for conversation and questions. We have a tradition here at the TOCO program is we always call our undergraduates first, and I want to extend that invitation to any undergraduates or visitors from Navy. We're delighted that you're here. So any undergraduates or visitors with a question first? Okay, before I call on you, make sure, whoever I call, stand up, let us know your affiliation, where you are. So Louis, why don't you begin?
So my name is Louis. I am a political science and history major. I'm a junior here at the University of Notre Dame. I guess my question is to Professor Desch. Can you maybe talk to the point that the Rear Admiral brought up about the fact that the Iranian regime has that time period to cover anything up before we go and inspect, and how we can just deal with the fact that they can kind of, cover up whatever they may be doing.
Yeah.
Mike, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question from the audience was, how do I react to Admiral Durr's critique of the side agreement between the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Iranians that dilutes the inspection regime by giving the Iranians 24 hours notice, and some other things that make it less than ideal, and it certainly is less than ideal. I would make a couple of points in response. I mean, first of all, this isn't unique to inspections regimes on arms control agreements. As a matter of fact, I'm guessing that some of the mutual inspection regimes between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War had similar sorts of provisions. So keep that in mind. This isn't the Obama administration was particularly spineless on this issue. There was a long precedent for that. But honestly, I think the on-site inspection is only a small part, and actually the least important part of the verification regime. And I'm a realist. Ronald Reagan famously said of the Soviets, trust but verify, and that's my view of the arrangement with the Iranians. And let me assure you.
Can I interject and ask you a question, having made that statement? What do you mean by trust the Iranians?
Well, we'll trust, they signed this agreement. I'm not going to just take them on face value. I'm going to continue to use all of the national technical and human source capabilities of the U.S. intelligence community and the intelligence communities of our allies to monitor what's going on in Iran. How many people have heard the term Stuxnet? Anybody give us a one-sentence description of the Stuxnet program, maybe an undergraduate? Yeah, it was an intelligence operation, probably a joint intelligence operation between the United States and Israel, directed against the Iranian nuclear program. Now, as an attack, as a campaign of cyber warfare, it ultimately was not that successful. But as an intelligence gathering operation, it was remarkable.
But it was largely Israeli. Largely Israeli.
Now that's
the Israelis have human intelligence in Iran that we wished we had.
Yeah,
they had inside information on how those centrifuges were controlled.
Yeah, we can argue about
from the
that.
intelligence agency.
Right, but I know people at NSA.
As do I.
Yeah, but the point is that whether it was Israeli, U.S., or some combination of it, the point is, and this is between 2007 and 2010, we had their program so wired that we were able to insert a piece of malware into an internal system that was protected from the internet by an air gap. So as the Admiral said, we, either us or the Israelis, had a human source within the system. I would argue, and this is a thing that really, sort of makes me a little bit crazy about the discussion of this whole thing, is it ignores the capability of the U.S. intelligence community to very closely monitor things in not only Iran, but a lot of other countries. But what Stuxnet demonstrated to me was that we had a very, very detailed understanding of the nuclear program. So the Admiral raises the, possibility that there is a secret black Iranian nuclear program. And it's, one of these things you can never completely disprove. But I have enough confidence in the U.S. intelligence community, and from what I've seen and what people on the inside have told me, that I think the likelihood of that is in fact very low. We have very good means of verifying this agreement, and we don't get out there and beat our breasts about it, not because we're modest, but simply because we have no interest in advertising our full capabilities. But every now and again, the extent of our capabilities to monitor things becomes apparent. And in this case, there's a lot more than meets the eye.
Let's get the Admiral to
Yeah, just give me a second to rejoinder here. First of all, the intelligence community's failures in detecting a number of things over the last 5 or 6 years are legion. The move into the Ukraine. No, wait a minute. I spent a long time in service of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I know a little bit about sources and methods. Overhead detection in clouded environments is impossible, regardless of the sophistication, unless it's infrared, and even then it's greatly diminished. Detecting nuclear particles in the air is something that can be guarded against, and we've done it very well over the years. Another point is when the Hezbollah fired an anti-ship cruise missile at an Israeli corvette in the last dust-up in Lebanon, the intelligence community had no idea that they had that missile. So to say that I'm going to be reassured that our intelligence sources and methods will in every case detect an Iranian breakout, I think is a little more optimistic than I dare get on a subject of this moment and magnitude.
Okay, let's see if we have another question from my undergraduate. Lincoln, please.
Lincoln, obviously political science major, senior here at university. My question is, why, okay, so my understanding is Iran came to the table in the first place because our sanctions were having a somewhat significant economic effect on them. But at the start of this deal, the very beginning, we're giving them a fairly large sum of resources, whether that's in freeing up tied up assets or whatever else. So what's to stop them from just taking that money and, well, taking the money and running, right? So just taking the resources they get there and then reneging on the deal immediately, a few months down the line. What are we really getting for that huge outflow, that huge resource we're putting for them right at the start?
Admiral, do you want to start with that one?
Well, I think it's a very good question. The question is, we're going to release $100 billion of frozen Iranian assets, not immediately, but when we're satisfied that they've met the preliminary provisions of the agreement. But the question is, so we release $100 billion in assets. I'm concerned some of it goes to the IGRC, but assuming it doesn't, and the Iranians decide now they've got their 100 billion rather, that they're going to break out. What's to prevent them from doing that? And the sad answer is the reimposition of sanctions, but not those that recover $100 billion.
I don't want to be in the position of saying that $100 billion isn't real money, because it certainly is. But the Iranian state stands to make far more money than that over the course of the next 15 to 25 years in an environment in which they're not subject to international sanctions. So, if your theory is that they've got their gun sights on this $100 billion, and they'll be happy with that, and they're going to take it whenever they get it. And by the way, it doesn't all come at once. And that's the game they're playing for, fine. But I think the evidence is that they're playing a different game, that they understand that the sanctions regime has hurt them across the board, and that relief from sanctions puts them in a position to make far more than $100 billion over the life of this agreement. So I find it ludicrous to think that that's the game. I mean, they may cheat, or they may, decide at some point to break out of this agreement. But I don't think that it's the take the money and run that would lead to that.
Okay, I mean, they could build an awfully nice football stadium. Let's open it up to...
Now, wouldn't it take $200 billion to...
Midshipman, fourth class cannon, good afternoon, gentlemen. I was wondering if we could ask the Admiral a question, specifically with regards to something you mentioned at the end of your speech, about penetrating weapons that the Israelis could potentially use. I'm assuming you're referring to the massive ordnance penetrator, so?
I'm referring to weapons that could penetrate the Ordo facility that only we can penetrate today.
So I was wondering, first of all, do the Israelis currently have platforms to deliver weapons of that size and class? And second of all, in the broader picture, what would an Israeli response to a potential Iranian nuclear breakout look like? Would they have the capabilities to counter that effectively as it stands now?
It's a very good question. Yeah, the question is, the Israeli, what weapon was I referring to that we might have given to the Israelis 10 years ago, long before the Iranians were this far down the road, to deter them from developing nuclear weapons on the assurance that if they did, they would lose the facility that they're trying to protect. But the other point is, do they have the aircraft? Do they have an aircraft capable of delivering the weapon? And my suspicion is that they do. They've got 707s, they have 737s, they have C-130s. They have what it takes. About 2 years ago, they launched an exercise in the Eastern Med where they scrambled almost 85% of the IAF, the Israeli Air Force, and flew a distance into the Mediterranean that was tantamount to an attack on the Iranian facilities in Ordo. And they ran coordinated jamming, fighter cover, AEW, the works. Would they lose airplanes in an attack on Iran? You bet. You bet. But as Netanyahu, who we heard something a little bit not terribly complimentary about earlier, sees Iran's nuclear potential as what he calls an existential threat to the state of Israel. And I have very little doubt in my military mind, softened somewhat by my own academic experience. I have very little doubt that if the Israelis, for whatever reason, come to the conclusion that Iran is closer to fielding a nuclear weapon, whether it's one of their own design or development or one that they acquire, which I think is also in the realm of possibility, Israel will act as assuredly as they acted against the Osirak reactor in Iraq. Israel has nuclear weapons. That's never declared, never flaunted, always understood by those who would threaten the state of Israel. They cannot afford to lose that qualitative edge against opposition that is sworn to destroy Israel. So if it looks as though that weapon is on the way, we may be in a position someday of watching the first exchange of nuclear weapons between Israel and Iran. And my greatest concern is that this agreement, since it doesn't extend into perpetuity, it may not be a problem for me or my generation, the 50-year club, but it could very well be a huge problem for my children and grandchildren, because that exchange could be the Armageddon that we read about in biblical scripture.
Yeah, a couple of things. I'm no fan of Bibi Netanyahu, but also you should understand that the debate within Israel and within the Israeli intelligence community is much broader than if you only got the Israeli position by listening to what Prime Minister Netanyahu's opinion is on these matters. For example, 7 or 8 of the last 10 directors of the Mossad, the Israeli equivalent of our CIA, have concluded that, like me, that this isn't a perfect deal, but on balance, it's better for Israel to have this deal than the alternatives. So, you know, I would be a little bit careful about reading Israeli opinion based on what one political party has to say about it.
I don't disagree with you, but I would look at the last election returns when the liberal media in this country was about to declare Netanyahu defeated, in part because of that power play of speaking to a joint session of our Congress, and he won overwhelmingly. And the second point...
Well, an overwhelming victory in a multi-party parliamentary system is 38%. That's what...
Let's get another.
Yeah.
But by the way, let me just get one last point on this, because I think it's also important, is that the 270 retired flag officers and general officers signed a public letter denouncing this agreement as saying not in the interest of the United States. Does that 270 of very accomplished and experienced individuals suggest that there's no support for the agreement in the United States?
We're talking about the Israeli intelligence.
But, I mean, I'm talking about my own polity, where a group of people very distinguished in their own right speak out vocally against an agreement. We're not confused. The Congress can't get
Okay,
the majority to override.
the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is the senior military advisor to the president, General Martin Dempsey, has been asked on a number of occasions what the considered opinion of the chiefs is on this issue. He's not spoken out against it. I don't, you know, I'm happy to hear what retired flag officers think, but
who are able to speak
Okay,
on their own
let's
right.
get another table, question on the table. There's a gentleman in the back who's been patient.
I was just going to ask if both speakers...
Stand up so we can hear you. And
I'm sorry.
are you here at Notre Dame? Tell us your...
Just a retired civilian. I was going to ask both gentlemen if they would amplify on what they would think would be the result militarily, economically, politically in the Middle East if this agreement did not go forward.
If this agreement did not what?
Did not go forward, what would be your prognostication, say, over the next 5 years, of what would happen politically, militarily, economically?
After you.
Okay, that's a big question. So
That's a short answer.
Okay.
That's a very, very good question, and I, like you, have some serious questions in my mind as to, given all of the publicity and all of the stock that has been put into completing this agreement, to not go through with it would be a very, very difficult thing in our relationships with the 5+1, and I'm more concerned about the Europeans than the Russians and the Chinese. But it would be a very difficult thing to undo at this point. So I, like you though, I have some serious questions in my mind about the ramifications beyond the group of 5+1 that did the agreement with Iran.
See, I interpreted your question a little bit differently. I interpreted it as saying, what if we didn't sign the agreement, and what if we pursued the alternative approaches that critics of the agreement have put out there? For example, maintaining sanctions. You know, I don't think that that's really in the cards, because the international community is not unified on this issue. So that leaves military options. And in one word, what would the Middle East look like if we were to go to war with Iran over this? And I'd invite you to look at what the situation was in Iraq between 2003 and, you know, roughly 2009 or 2010. It would be a mess. And we would open Pandora's box. Admiral Durr lamented the fact that this agreement does nothing to restrict Iranian power in the region. And I think that's true. But if you were to ask me, what was the thing the United States has done in recent history that has done the most to enhance Iranian standing in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East more generally, I would say in March of 2003, we overthrew the key bulwark containing Iranian power. When he was in the Reagan administration had a cynical, but I think ultimately realistic policy of balancing Iran off of Iraq and maintaining a balance of power in the region in the way that statesmen have played realpolitik from time immemorial. What we did in 2003 is we broke that system. And one of the results of breaking that system was that we increased Iran's standing in an order of magnitude beyond what this agreement will do.
I'm less concerned about Iranian standing or Iranian power. I'm much more concerned about Iranian sponsorship of state terrorism. And that began long before 2003. It began in the 70s and the 80s, and it continues to this day apace. But the other point that I think bears some thought, at least, is that the Iranians today will be enriched. They will be made more respectable, for want of a better term, by dint of the fact that they'll be able to host Western business that they haven't been able in the past. But why couldn't we, somewhere in the course of this negotiation, force them to revoke support for outfits that the world understands are Iranian-controlled and murderous in their behavior? Why couldn't we have insisted on that?
Okay, real quick, and then we'll do one last question.
Okay, so one of the groups that the Admiral doesn't like, and I can appreciate why he doesn't like Hezbollah, is in fact fighting in Syria against the group that I regard as the greatest terrorist threat that we face today, which is ISIS or ISIL. And honestly, I can't shed too many tears about these two groups killing each other. But the truth of the matter is it's cynical and seems cold-blooded, but I don't have any trouble with Hezbollah's activities under Iranian support, because the Iranians are certainly supportive of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Now, I understand, because again, you were in government at the time of the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, and I don't blame you for not forgiving Hezbollah. But I would say, when did Hezbollah come on the scene? And what American allies' activities in the south of Lebanon opened the door for Hezbollah to become the dominant actor among Lebanese Shia? And of course, the answer is the Israelis. So it's a complicated world. And if you don't like Hezbollah, you also have to, it seems to me, blame our allies, the Israelis, for saddling us with this problem.
Let's get one last question.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Robert Anderson, visiting scholar at the Rising Center. Many years ago, I reviewed in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists a book called The Islamic Bomb. And it was basically about the Pakistani weapons program, fed by the Johnny Appleseed of nuclear proliferation, A.Q. Khan. It seems to me the breakout
is a what?
It's a major disaster area, including our interventions in Iraq. My question is that if this deal does not go forward, that the Islamic bomb was essentially a Christian bomb. It was built by France, Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Italy. They bent over backwards to accommodate the Pakistani weapons program, sub-Rosa, whatever. This deal does not go through. It will be America's bomb. The Iranians, for all intents and purposes, already have the nuclear weapons capability. Israelis know this. I don't understand where we can go unless we go down your path, which is a total showdown with Iran. The Israelis would love to have us go in and take out the sites, because they wouldn't have to do it. You say they're going to do it at some point. I want to see what is the alternative here. This is a Hobson's choice of the first magnitude. Where do we go?
Absolutely, and I don't, by the way, I share your concern about the nuclear balance in South Asia. In fact, the proliferation of weapons between India and Pakistan was a disaster that we couldn't avert 35 years ago. But I would say this to you about the Israeli versus ourselves option. I despair that any administration would act militarily against Iran unless Iran had issued a palpable threat and a declaratory threat to use a weapon. The Israelis, by contrast, will act on intelligence. I don't think there's enough gumption left in this country or enough support in the American populace as expressed in their Congress to sanction a significant military action against Iran unless there were a declared threat to the United States, arguably to Israel. But I think long before that, Israel would have acted in its own behalf.
Yeah, just very briefly. I agree. India-Pakistan is the rhinoceros in the room, and we're not even talking about it. But that's not what the topic was today. Israel has a significant nuclear capability, somewhere between 100 and 200 nuclear warheads, and a robust strategic triad. They're the third or fourth largest nuclear power in the world, and I think that that's fine. That they live in a bad neighborhood. There's a history that makes it perfectly understandable that they would be acutely sensitive to the security of their state. But they have an overwhelming nuclear capability. If we believe that nuclear weapons deter, and we do, and that was the lesson of the Cold War, why aren't they satisfied with that? And again, to be a little bit provocative, I would suggest that this isn't about an existential threat to Israel at this point. What it's about is Israel's ability to maintain a hegemonic position beyond the defense of its own borders. And what the real danger of an Iranian nuclear weapon is that it would reduce Israel's, the utility of Israel's nuclear weapons to only defending its homeland. Now you say only defending its homeland, well, that seems to me it's a pretty big deal. And is it worth going to war to give Israel the ability to micromanage larger parts of the Middle East? And I'm not persuaded
You won't
that
have
it
to
is.
go to war. You won't have to go to war. If you choose not to act in the face of intelligence that they have broken out and are about to field a nuclear weapon, you won't have to act. They will act in your stead or in their stead. Of that I am as sure as I sit here.
I wish we had more time. We're going to have to have you back, Admiral. We have a great tradition that's coming up in just a few months called the Bengal bout. I bet you we could. Maybe this will be our next event. Thank you very much for coming, and I know a few more of you had questions. If you want to come up to the table, I'm sure our interlocutors will Honored.